I want to start by taking a question away from you. The question is, why did the fish stop biting? And I think that one question has quietly ruined more fishing trips than any cold front ever has. Because buried inside, it is an assumption you never agreed to. It assumes biting is the default, that a fish wakes up switched on, feeds until something out there flips it off, and your only job is to sit in the boat and wait for the switch to flip back on its own. There is no switch. There was never a switch. A fish is not a mood. A fish is a ledger. Every second it is alive. It is running one calculation, over and over, on everything that drifts, darts, or wobbles past its face. Is catching that thing worth more energy than catching it will cost me? And is it worth the risk of dying to try? That is the entire animal. So when your lure swims past and nothing happens, the fish did not turn off. It ran the math, and you lost the bid. Welcome back to Fishing Lab Explained. Today I am going to hand you a single lens, and I want you to hold it through this whole video because it quietly dissolves about 6 different fishing superstitions at once. Water temperature, a full stomach, a passing storm, a bright sky, a hammered lake, the spawn. The common wisdom treats these as 6 separate reasons a fish shuts down. They are not 6 reasons. They are 6 different hands shoving on the exact same equation. Learn the equation, and you stop guessing at moods and start reading a balance sheet. And once you can read the balance sheet, a dead bite stops looking like a locked door and starts looking like a price tag. The fish quoted you a price. Your lure didn't pay it. Let me show you the math. Here is the equation, and I am not making it up. Biologists wrote it down. Back in 1977, James Kitchell and his colleagues at the University of Wisconsin's Center for Limnology built what is still called the Wisconsin Bioenergetics model. It is, to this day, the backbone of how fisheries science accounts for where a fish's energy actually goes. Strip out the algebra and it says something almost insultingly simple. Everything a fish eats gets split into a handful of piles. One pile pays the metabolic bill, the flat cost of just being alive, pumping a heart, holding station against the current, keeping the lights on. One pile pays for digestion itself because, and this is the part I need you to sit with, eating is not free. Breaking a meal down burns a real slice of that meal's own energy. Physiologists call that cost-specific dynamic action, and in fish it can eat well into the double digits of everything the fish just swallowed. One more pile is waste. And only whatever survives after all those bills are paid, only the leftover, can go into the 2 things a fish is actually built to do: grow and make more fish. Now look at what that does to a single strike. When a bass decides whether to run down your crankbait, it is not asking, "Does that look tasty?" It is pricing a transaction. The chase costs energy. The grab costs energy. The digestion that follows will cost energy. And leaving cover to do any of it spends something even more precious than calories. It spends safety. Against that whole stack of costs, the fish weighs one number. How many calories is this thing worth? And how sure am I of collecting them? Ecologists have a name for animals that behave exactly like this. They call it optimal foraging theory. The idea, worked out by researchers like Robert MacArthur and Eric Pianka back in the 1960s, that natural selection relentlessly tunes a predator to maximize net energy gained for every unit of effort spent. A fish that burns more chasing than it banks eating does not grow, does not spawn, and fairly quickly does not exist. So a few million years of that arithmetic have handed you an opponent that is, functionally, an accountant with fins. Which means the smart move is not to ask what mood it is in. The smart move is to audit its books. 6 variables, 1 equation. Let's go line by line. Variable 1, temperature. And everyone gets this half right, which is worse than getting it all wrong, because the half they get right hides the half that actually catches fish. Yes, a fish is ectothermic, cold-blooded. Its body runs at whatever temperature the water hands it, and its metabolism rises and falls with that water like a needle on a gauge. There is a rule of thumb in physiology called Q10, and for most fish it lands somewhere around 2 to 3. In plain English, warm the water by roughly 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and the fish's baseline metabolism does not creep up. It roughly doubles, sometimes closer to triples. Here is where the common wisdom stops, and just says, "So cold fish are sluggish." And sure, but watch what temperature is really doing to the ledger, because it is not pushing on one side, it is pushing on both at once. On the cost side, a warmer fish is burning calories faster, which means it needs to eat more just to break even. Its appetite is not a mood, it is a debt collector. That is the side everyone knows, but temperature is simultaneously working the other side of the sheet, the side almost no fishing video mentions, and it is the more useful half. Temperature controls how fast the fish empties its own stomach. Fisheries scientists call it gastric evacuation, and it has been measured carefully for decades. Malcolm Jobling built some of the classic models of it back in the early 1980s. The finding is clean and it is ruthless. In cold water, a fish digests slowly. A meal can sit in the gut for a very long time, and until that gut clears, the fish is simply not hungry. The benefit side of every new strike is pinned near zero, because it is already full and in no rush to make room. Warm that same water up, and digestion accelerates hard. The stomach clears in hours instead of days. And a fish with an empty stomach and a fast metabolism is a fish whose ledger is screaming to be fed. Do you see what just happened? The books people keep as two separate reasons. Reason number 1, the water's too cold, and reason number 6, the fish are full, are not two reasons. They are the same dial. A bass that gorged on shad in 45-degree November water might genuinely not need to eat again for days, because nothing in its gut is going anywhere. The same bass, the same meal, in 70-degree June water, is hungry again by afternoon. So when someone tells you cold water fish don't bite, what is actually true is narrower and far more useful. Cold water does not switch the appetite off. It stretches the time between meals to something enormous, and it drops the whole ledger into slow motion, which is exactly why the cold water answer is not to fish harder or faster, but slower, smaller, and directly in front of a fish's face. So the calories are almost free, and the price of the strike collapses to nearly nothing. You are not waking a fish up, you are making it an offer so cheap that even a fish in slow motion pencils it out as worth the effort. And this reframes the so-called cold water specialists too. A trout holding in 42-degree water in February is not being tough. It is not biting through bad conditions. Its entire ledger was built to balance at that temperature. The metabolic tax that flattens a largemouth is just the trout's normal cost of doing business. Bass peak, roughly, between the mid-60s and low 80s. Trout do their best accounting far colder, down in the 50s and below. Neither one is braver than the other. They just keep their books in different climates. Match your target to the water that keeps its ledger open, and you have won half the day before you make a cast. Variable 2, and I am going to be honest, I already spent it. Satiation, a full fish. But I want to hit the version of it that actually loses people fish, because it looks nothing like an empty-looking lake. Picture a trout stream in a heavy blue-winged olive hatch. The surface is dimpling. Fish are rising every few seconds, openly, greedily, right in front of you, and they will not touch your fly. Every angler has stood in that river and wanted to throw the rod in it. And the folk explanation, they're being picky, is true but useless, because it does not tell you why. The ledger tells you why. When a lake or a river floods with easy, identical prey, a shad spawn, a mayfly hatch, a bait ball the size of a school bus, the fish is not choosing to be difficult. It is doing the only rational thing on the balance sheet. When the pantry is stacked with 1,000 effortless calories that all look the same, the payoff per unit of effort on the real thing is so high that anything requiring extra work, extra hesitation, extra risk, like your slightly wrong imitation, drops below the line. The fish is not full. It is spoiled for choice. Your lure is not being rejected because it is ugly. It is being rejected because the fish has a cheaper option, and the ledger will always take the cheaper option, which tells you exactly what to do, and it is the opposite of trying harder. You do not outflash the hatch. You either match it so precisely that your offering costs the fish nothing to accept, same size, same silhouette, same drift, or you flip the whole equation and hand the fish a calorie deal so large it overrides the easy option. A single meal worth more than 50 of the little ones. That is the real logic under match the hatch and throw a big bait in a bait ball, And it is not two tricks. It is one accountant, choosing the better deal both times. Variable 3. The storm, barometric pressure, and this is the one I most want to take apart, because the entire tackle shop religion around it is built on a mechanism that mostly does not hold up, and the honest version is more useful anyway. You have heard the sermon. Pressure falls, fish feed. Pressure rises, fish sulk. And the reason given is always the swim bladder, that little gas-filled organ the fish uses for buoyancy, supposedly getting squeezed and stretched by the changing weight of the sky until the fish feels sick and stops eating. Here is the problem, and it comes straight from someone who studied the ocean for a living. David Ross, a scientist emeritus at the Woods Hole Oceanographic Institution and the author of The Fisherman's Ocean, laid the numbers out plainly in Fisherman. Water is about 800 times denser than air, which means the pressure change a fish feels from even a dramatic storm rolling through is trivially small next to the pressure change it creates just by swimming. Run the math, and a full 1 inch of mercury barometric swing, a serious front, puts about the same pressure change on a fish as that fish moving roughly 13 inches up or down in the water column. 13 inches. A fish adjusts to more pressure change than the worst storm of the year every single time it drops off a ledge to grab a crawfish and rises back up. The swim bladder is not being tortured by the sky. It handles bigger swings before breakfast. So does that mean pressure is a total myth and the front doesn't matter? No. And this is the flip. The front absolutely matters. It just is not doing what you were told, and the ledger reveals the real chain of events. That aggressive, almost frantic feeding right before a front? That is not discomfort. That is a forecast. A dropping barometer travels with a whole package of change. Wind, cloud, a coming disruption to the light and the water, and a fish reading that package is doing the smartest thing on its balance sheet. It is front-loading. Buy calories now, while they are cheap and easy, because the price is about to go up. That is a fish gorging on purpose, and it is the single best window the weather ever hands you. Then the front passes, and the fishing dies. And again, not because of pressure, because of what rolls in behind a front. High skies, hard flat sunlight, and a wind that swings and scatters the bait a fish had lined up. The bright post-front sky drives the payoff side of the ledger down. A fish that can be seen as easily as it can see loses its ambush, so the smart accounting move is to stop spending and wait. The cold front never shut the fish off with a pressure switch. It just changed the prices. Watch the trend, fish the falling window hard, and forgive the bluebird day after. The books are just temporarily bad. Variable 4. Light. And I am going to keep this one short on purpose because I have spent entire videos inside the eye of a walleye and the physics of the low-light window, and I am not going to rerun that whole machine here. Go watch those if you want the deep cut. For the ledger, all you need is the headline. Light does not change a fish's hunger. It changes the odds. In the failing light of dawn and dusk, and under a heavy overcast, a predator's eyes hold their edge, while its prey goes blind first, and the probability of a clean, successful capture climbs. Higher success probability means a higher expected payoff on every strike, which lifts the whole equation over the line. At high noon under a bright sky, the predator loses that edge. The odds of a wasted, energy-burning miss go up, and the rational move, again, not a mood, an audit, is to hold in the shade and wait for the numbers to improve. Light is not the on-off switch either. It is a thumb on the payoff side of the scale. Variable 5. Fishing pressure. And this is where the common wisdom is not just shallow. It is missing the most unsettling fact in freshwater fishing. You have heard the explanation 100 times. The fish get educated. They learn to avoid the lure. And that is partly true. Fish absolutely learn within their own lifetime. But it is the small half of the story. The big half was uncovered in a study that ran for 2 decades, and once you know it, you will never look at a pressured lake the same way. Starting in the 1970s, David Phillip and a team out of the University of Illinois and the Illinois Natural History Survey ran a selection experiment on the largemouth bass of Ridge Lake. Every fish that got caught was tagged and recorded. Over 4 years of controlled angling, they built a complete census of who got fooled and who didn't. and the numbers were staggering in both directions. One base got caught 3 times in the first 2 days, another got caught 16 times in a single year, and at the other end, about 15% of the fish in that lake never got caught, not once, in 4 full years of people fishing for them. Then here is what they did next. They took the fish that bit easily and bred them together, and took the fish that almost never bit and bred them together, and did it for 3 generations, and the split widened every generation. The offspring of the easy-to-catch fish were easy to catch. The offspring of the wary fish were wary. They put a number on it. The trait's heritability came out to around 0.15, which means this, and it is the sentence I want you to carry to the water. Vulnerability to your lure is partly written in the genes. Sit with what that does to a hammered public lake. Every season, anglers act as a filter. The fish that bite easily get caught, get handled, get stressed, and get selectively removed from the still swimming and never bothered column. What is left over years is a population increasingly weighted toward fish whose ledgers demand a steeper deal before they will ever spend energy on a risky, artificial-looking target. So when you fish pressured water and everything ignores you, you are not just facing fish that learn today, you may be facing the descendants of the fish that were born hard to fool, animals running a more conservative balance sheet by nature, with the risk term dialed permanently higher. This is precisely why rotating colors, presentations, and cadences outfishes, stubbornly throwing the same thing, and why a lake that has rested overnight comes back to life. You are not waiting for the fish to forget. You are hunting for a presentation the local accountants have not yet been trained, or bred, to distrust. Give them something that does not trip the risk alarm, and the ledger reopens. Variable 6, the spawn. The longest, most predictable dead stretch on the calendar, and the one people most often explain as hormones turn the feeding off. Close, but the ledger says it cleaner. During the spawn, the fish does not lose its appetite. It reallocates its entire budget. Remember the equation. After the bills, the leftover energy splits between growth and reproduction. Come spawning season, reproduction seizes almost the whole account. A female base pours a staggering amount of stored energy into producing eggs, and after she drops them, she is not sulking in deep water. She is in genuine energy debt, physically spent, and her books simply cannot justify an aggressive, expensive chase for a while. That is not a mood. That is an overdrawn account recovering. And this reframes the 2 things anglers get most wrong about the spawn. First, the pre-spawn. In the weeks before she commits, that same female is doing the exact opposite, feeding as hard as she will feed all year, because the ledger is demanding she stockpile the capital for the single most expensive thing she will ever do. That is why pre-spawn is the best big fish window on the calendar, and it is not luck, it is a fish under orders to load the account. Second, the bedfish. When a male bass on a nest smashes your lure, read it correctly. He is very often not feeding at all. That strike is a line item from a completely different budget, territory and offspring defense, and treating a defensive hit like a feeding pattern will fool you every single time about how the fishery is really behaving. And because we are talking about fish that are spawning, one flat rule from the lab: this is the moment a fishery is most vulnerable, and a spawning female played to exhaustion and mishandled in warm air may not spawn again. Know the season, keep them wet, keep it quick, and check your state and local regulations, because closed seasons and bed fishing rules exist for exactly this reason, and they are not the same everywhere. So let's close the books. Step back and look at all 6 variables at once, because now they should look completely different than they did 20 minutes ago. Temperature, satiation, the storm, the light, the pressure, the spawn. The old model told you these were 6 separate switches, each one capable of turning the fish off, and it left you sitting in the boat waiting for something to turn them back on. But there is no switch on any of them. There is only the one equation, and each of these is just a hand pushing on it. Temperature sets the tax and the clock. Satiation and the hatch move the payoff. The front changes the prices and the forecast. Light moves the odds. Pressure raises the risk term, sometimes for a day, sometimes across generations. And the spawn drains the account into reproduction. 6 hands, 1 ledger. And here is the whole point. The thing I want to actually change about how you fish. A fish that ignores your lure has not closed a door. There is no door. It has handed you a price tag, a price quoted in calories and risk, and your presentation did not meet it, which means you are never truly waiting for the bite to come back. You are always holding 4 tools to move the price yourself. Lower the cost. Smaller, slower, closer, easier to eat. Raise the payoff. A bigger, higher calorie target, or the low light window when the odds swing your way. Lower the risk. A presentation the local fish have not been trained or bred to fear. Or simply fish the moments when the fish's own math is already screaming yes. The pre-front gorge, the post-digestion window, the pre-spawn load-up. That is the difference between the angler who blames a slow day on bad luck and the one who quietly keeps catching. One of them believes in a switch. The other one reads the ledger and changes the offer. So let me leave you with the claim that I know is going to start a fight in the comments, because I want it to. I do not believe there is any such thing as a negative fish. I think there are only prices we failed to meet. Every dead bite you have ever cursed was a transaction you could have repriced. You just didn't know the books were open. So tell me down below. Tell me about the deadest, most impossible no-bite day you have ever had, the lake full of fish you could see and could not touch, and now that you can read the ledger, tell me what you would change if you could stand on that bank again. What was the price, and how would you meet it? I read every one of these, and the best answers are always from the people who stopped believing in the switch. Thanks for spending this one in the lab. Hit like if it changed how you see a slow day, subscribe if you want the why behind the water every week, and I will see you out there, reading the books, changing the offer. Keep questioning the obvious.